Hello aspirants, welcome to Vishnu IAS Academy. Hope you're all doing well. Hope your studies are also going on a good pace, I expect. So today we're going to talk about in detail about some principles that are directly laid down in the Constitution of India, which act as a guide for the states to frame the policies and the programs for the upliftment of its citizens, as well as the laws also. Okay, the Constitution, apart from giving rights to its citizens, also provides some guidelines for the states also in framing the laws for ruling of its people and also uplifting them economically, socially, or whatever it is. Okay, so those principles are said to be the directive principles of the state policy. Okay, these directive principles of the state policy are embedded in Part 4 of the Constitution, ranging from Articles 36 to 51. Clear? Directive principles of the state policy, Part 4 of the Constitution, and articles ranging from 36 to 51. Okay, so this is just a very brief introduction of the DPSP. And now, if you see the first question of it, so now we are going to the detailed analysis of previous year UPSC Prelims questions related to the topic directive principles of the state policy. Okay, so here comes the first question. What is it? Under the Indian Constitution, concentration of wealth violates. See, under the Indian Constitution, concentration of wealth. Concentration means the wealth being present only in some of the influential hands, but not distributed among all the people. Isn't that so? So this principle of concentration violates, concentration of wealth violates. What are the options given? The right to equality, the directive principles of the state policy, the right to freedom, and the concept of welfare. Okay, now if you see the explanation, you'll be getting the answer without any confusion. See, according to Article 39C, so what did we discuss in the introduction class? Directive principles range from Articles 36 to 51. Isn't that so? So in between, now we are talking about article specifically 39 clause C. Okay, so what does this article states is that according to Article 39C of the Directive Principles of the Indian Constitution, the operation of any economic system should not result in the concentration of wealth and means of production to the common detriment. Okay, so one of the principles, most important principles embedded in directive principles of state policy is that, it says that economic system of any of the state should not be operated in such a manner that the wealth will be concentrated in whosever the hands may be, that leads to the detrimental of that state or the society or the economy. Okay, so that means the wealth should not be concentrated in the hands of autocratic mindset people. Okay, so this is what all this means. So hence the concentration of wealth weakens the directive principles of the state policy. So this principle of concentration of wealth, okay, weakens the main principle of the directive principles of the state policy. So which means that the answer over here is the B, that is directive principles of the state policy. Concentration of wealth is against the principles of directive principles of the state policy. Is it clear? Very good. Now, just a very brief introduction about directive principles of the state policy. As we have said, Articles 36 to 51 cover DPSP and they are present in the Part 4 of the Indian Constitution. Okay, and what is the source of these directive principles of the state policy? Actually, our Indian Constitution has derived directive principles of the state policy from the Irish Constitution, okay, of 1937, and Irish Constitution in turn has copied it from the Spanish Constitution. So Spanish Constitution to Irish Constitution, and from Irish Constitution we have derived these directive principles of the state policy. Clear? Okay, good. Now, the provisions contained in this part cannot be enforced by any court. Unlike the fundamental rights are guaranteed by the Supreme Court as well. But these directive principles are not guaranteed by the Supreme Court, which means if these directive principles of the state policy are not enforced by any of the state, any citizen or any government cannot approach court for the justified application of these principles. But despite of this, every state will genuinely follow the directive principles given in this part 4 of the Constitution in framing their rules, laws and policies also. Okay, so but these are not enforceable by any court of the law, just like the rights over there. Okay, and it shall be the duty of the government to enforce all this, even though they are not enforceable by the court. Clear? This is just a very brief introduction related to the question. Okay, now, while most of the fundamental rights are negative obligations on the state, DPSPs are positive obligations on the state, though not enforceable in a court of law. Listen carefully. Most of the fundamental rights are negative obligations on the state. What does this mean? Whereas DPSPs are positive obligations on the state. Negative obligations means that fundamental rights are framed in such a way that they will be suppressing the arbitrary powers of the state. That means whenever the state is trying to implement or frame any of the law, it has to be very cautious, reminding itself about the fundamental right, because all the laws which are made or framed by the state should never ever violate or disturb or interfere with the rights provided to the citizens, which means that it will be curbing the powers, or it will be fundamental rights will be restricting the powers of the state, which are negative obligations of a state, whereas directive principles of the state policy empower the state in framing any of the laws. Okay, so which means that I hope you might have understood what this statement means over here. Fundamental rights are the negative obligations, whereas directive principles of the state policy are positive obligations on the head of a state. Clear? Right. Now, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, he describes directive principles of the state policy as novel features, means very noble features of the Constitution. Okay, so they are the noblest ideals that have been put forward for the upliftment of any of the citizens. Okay, now these principles aim at ensuring what is the main aim of framing these principles? To ensure socio-economic justice for the people and establishing India as a welfare state. Okay, so socio-economic justice will be upheld, okay, of any of the state's people, and also the welfare of that concerned state is also guaranteed by applying this directive principles of the state policy. Okay, clear? Now we are going to the next question. What is the question? With reference to the provisions contained in part 4 of the Constitution, what is the part 4? Directive principles of the state policy. Which of the following statements are correct? Okay, these are the 3 statements that have been given, and they are asking us to relate which of the statements, to relate these statements to the DPSP and state which are true and which are false. Clear? What is the first statement? Directive principles, they means directive principles of the state policy shall be enforceable by courts. First statement. Second, they shall not be enforceable by any court. And third statement is the principles laid down in this part are to influence the making of the laws by the state. From the above 3 statements, which are correct? Either 1, 2, 1 and 3 or 2 and 3. Okay. Now, let's see the solution. So as usual, directive principles of the state policy contained in part 4 of the Constitution. Okay. And they also serve as the guidelines for the state for implementing for formulating as well as implementing policies and laws aimed for the social and economic welfare of the people. Every policy, every program, every law of the state should be made for the welfare of its citizens only, both economically as well as socially also. Okay, so these laws or these programs should be made in align with the principles given in the constitution only. Those principles are DPSPs. Okay, now these principles reflect the ideals of, what do these principles reflect? They reflect the ideals of justice, okay, liberty, equality and fraternity, which are essential for achieving a justified society or a equal society in India. Okay, so these are the 4 principles that will be reflecting the directive principles of the state policy. When only these 4 principles are achieved, then only equality in the society will also be achieved. Okay, is the main hope of the constitution framers in framing this DPSP. Clear? Now, first let's see the enforceability. Statement 1. Okay, so it is said that whether these DPSPs are enforceable by the courts or not is the statement given over there, right? So it states that provisions contained in DPSP are not enforceable by any court of law. Okay, nobody can go to the court for pleading of implementation of these DPSPs in case a state seems not to be following these. Clear? Now, not enforceable by any court, which we have discussed. Okay, this means that individuals cannot approach the courts to seek enforcement of these principles. Though the state doesn't, okay, approach, doesn't influence, doesn't frame the laws in alliance with these DPSPs, nobody is having the right to go to the court over this matter. Okay, and now the Supreme Court of India in various judgments, okay, has upheld that DPSPs are not justifiable. Not justiciable meaning that they do not carry legal obligations that can be enforced through judicial mechanisms. They do not contain any of the legal obligations such that they are being enforceable by the judicial mechanisms. So judiciary doesn't interfere at all in the DPSP principles. Clear? Okay. Now, what is their influence on the lawmaking? How are DPSPs? What significance role do DPSPs have in lawmaking of any state? Is that the principles laid down in the DPSPs are intended to influence the law making in any state. DPSPs are framed in such a manner that every state, okay, has to be obliged to take guidance from the DPSPs. Okay, they are prepared in such a manner, first thing. And second thing is that this indicates that while these principles are not enforceable in any court of the law, they play a very critical role in shaping legislation and policies. Though judiciary doesn't interfere in their implementation, but the states, they are very serious in considering DPSPs while framing any of the laws because of the criticalness or of the significance assigned to these guidelines or the principles, directive principles. Clear? Very good. Now, now states are having the responsibility to take these principles into account while drafting any of the laws to ensure that they align with the broader goals of the social justice and welfare. Even the states are supposed to be responsible in grabbing all the principles from this directive principles to frame the laws such that the citizens or the people of the states social justice as well as economic justice will be upheld in any society. Okay, good. Clear? So the answer over here is they shall be enforceable by courts. No. Directive principles of the state policy are not enforceable by any courts. They shall not be enforceable by any court. Yes, this statement is true. The principles laid down in this part are to influence the making of the laws by the state. Yes, true. So the answer is 2 and 3 only. That is option D is correct over here. Clear? Good. Now let's see the next question. Question. In India, separation of judiciary from the executive is enjoined by. Can you guess the answer? Most of the answer has been laid in the second question itself. Just now we have discussed, right? So let's see. In India, separation of judiciary from the executive is enjoined by. Okay, is instructed by which part of the constitution? Is it by the preamble of the constitution, or a directive principle of a state policy, the 7th schedule, or the conventional practice? Okay, let's see. Detailed solution for this. First of all, the answer is directive principles of the state policies. How come? Article 50 of the Indian Constitution, that is embedded in the DPSP, specifically enjoins the separation of judiciary from the executive in the public services of the state. This is the article which separates judiciary from the executive. What does it state? It says that enjoins the separation of judiciary from the executive in public services of any state. So we can say that judiciary and executive are divided by the Article 50 of the DPSP. So the answer is directive principles of the state policy. So this is anyways the definition which we are aware of. Okay. And now, what is preamble? Preamble of the constitution is nothing but the introduction or the foreword of any of the constitution. Okay, of our constitution, of Indian constitution, and it sets out, what does this preamble say? It says about the philosophy and also the objectives of the constitution in a brief manner. It introduces about the philosophy as well as the objectives of the entire constitution in some brief words. That's it. Okay, but it does not specifically mention about the separation of judiciary and the executive powers. Clear? Good. Now, what does the 7th schedule talk about? The 7th schedule of the constitution deals with the distribution of legislative powers between the union and the state. Here, there will be no talking about the executive. It simply talks about the distribution of legislative powers between the states and the union. Clear? It talks about only about legislative powers. Distribution of legislative powers between center and states. That's it. There won't be any mention of judiciary or the separation between the judiciary and executive over here. Okay, and the separation of judiciary from the executive is a fundamental feature of the constitution aimed at maintaining independence and impartiality of the judiciary. Why there is a need for the separation of judiciary and the executive? Because to ensure the impartial functioning of the judiciary without any outsider's influence or interference. That is the reason why the separation of judiciary from the executive has been made mandatory in our constitution, which is a very, very fundamental, the main and very, very important principle of the constitution. Okay, to enable the independence and also the free, frictionless functioning of the judiciary. Clear? So now, what do you think is the answer? Obviously, it is the answer B, that is directive principles of the state policy. Okay, hope you got at least some idea about DPSP. I'm talking about the beginners, but not to those who have already read this topic. So if you're having any doubts or if you're having any suggestions to give, or if you want any kind of explanation or any kind of topic change in this, please do comment or put all your opinions in the comment section. We'll be very, very glad to implement all those. Okay, thank you and all the best. Bye.